this week we find ourselves in a very special week called Holy Week. It's the week that we as Christians take a pause and begin to reflect on the last week of Jesus' earthly ministry, leading him up to Friday, which is the cross, and Sunday, which is the resurrection. But every day this week, I wanted to take a moment and help encourage your heart and help you reflect on what happens in the life of Jesus every day through this week. And so in Mark chapter 11, we see what happens on this Monday. Starting in verse 15, it says that they, Jesus and the disciples, came to Jerusalem. And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'?" Listen to this. "But you have made it a den of robbers." On this particular Monday, many of you probably find yourself working from home, or maybe you haven't had work in several weeks. But on this particular Monday, Jesus, he walks into Jerusalem to really take care of some business. You know, the meek and the mild Jesus of progressive tolerance really is nowhere to be found in this picture. I mean, he made a mess of the money changers, and there's nothing soft or tender about this Jesus that's on display here. And he pronounced a resounding judgment of rebuke over the people who he finds in the temple. Now, if you can imagine, I mean, the city would have been packed with foreigners and pilgrims and sojourners coming into Jerusalem for the Passover. They would have come into the temple to ultimately offer sacrifices, and some were seizing an opportunity to make a little bit extra money. Kind of like someone who would stand outside your local supermarket selling toilet paper. And the man behind the table, he gouges those prices and he shouts, "Hey, come on, get your toilet paper here. You're out of toilet paper, come get them right here." Except this was the temple. And these people, they were selling sacrificial birds, and they were looking to make up a personal gain. And the prices were probably jacked up higher than ever. Without a doubt, Jesus would have none of it. Astonished by his authority, Jesus spoke for God as he turned the tables upside down. In verse 17, it says that my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. Isaiah in the Old Testament, the prophet, Isaiah 56, it tells us that eunuchs would come and they would keep God's covenant. That foreigners would come and join themselves to the Lord and to God. And even the outcast would be gathered with his people. But as Jesus comes into this place which God designed for the nations to seek the Lord, it was overrun by opportunists buying and selling, and the Jewish leaders, they were allowing it to happen. Jesus, he had enough. And the worship of God's people was out of line with what God desired. It had to stop. So Jesus, he turns the table to make room for all of those who would come. The great sadness wasn't so much that the money-hungry price gouging was happening, but that really it left no room for the Gentiles and the outcasts and the foreigners to once again come to God. This place of worship was to be a place of hope for all of God's people, a place to remember God's promises, a place to remember his restoring work through the nations. This was the day that all nations should come unto the Lord. And so my encouragement for you on this Monday is that wherever you find yourself, know that God desires to meet with you. That through Jesus Christ, you can have a relationship with God. Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice to end all sacrifices. Maybe you're here today and you just simply feel like you have nothing to bring to God. Maybe you're listening to this and you feel like an outcast. come into his courts. Come in with praise. Come into his presence. After all, Jesus turned the tables so that people just like you, just like me, could come to him just as we are. Thanks for listening. I hope this encourages your heart. I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.